otherwise remarkably finished, tells more about our hypocritical, quasi-scientific background than all the ballyhoo of success can cover up. That is the reason why such a gigantic affair as photography, with its numerous branches, has not developed a real photographic style, or a style to be called the expression of the photographic era. All we can expect is fashions, trends, changing with the seasons of the customer's appetites. The future.
Otherwise remarkably finished, tells more about our hypocritical, quasi-scientific background than all the ballyhoo of success can cover up. That is the reason why such a gigantic affair as photography, with its numerous branches, has not developed a real photographic style, or a style to be called the expression of the photographic era. All we can expect is fashions, trends, changing with the seasons of the customer's appetites. The future. All this seems to indicate that there is not much sense in bothering about culture, since it is obviously not for us. In reality, many people have come to the conclusion that religion, culture, and art are simply matters of the past, like dinosaurs, never to return. Still, nature, or whatever name we prefer for that which makes our body and the organism of mankind function far beyond the limits of scientific knowledge, seems to have better intentions than one would expect in dark moments. It also seems that photography lends itself as perfectly to the program of nature or historical forces as it expresses man's manias. The first most vital point would be the presence of a living creative idea capable of electrifying body and soul, of individual and society, into a high voltage with knowledge and faith to give direction and meaning to life and death. According to examples from the past, even such a start is not quite sufficient unless a mental and spiritual parallelism, something like the famous Gleichschaltung, takes place within the given unit of society. It is evident that contemporary art in general, and photography in particular, shows daily a multitude of disoriented and opposed directions. To understand the waste of energy resulting from such a situation, remember what happens to telephone wires. 5 wires plus 5 wires are 10 wires. If I send currents through those wires while they are close together and parallel, each current produces through induction another current in every other wire, and if one party tries to speak through each wire, you may hear many conversations simultaneously on each wire. Something similar takes place with minds, seen as senders of fields of energy. A little diagram might be of help. This diagram shows 8 centers of energy with 8 energy rays each. Without going into higher mathematics, it is obvious that most of the rays are neutralizing each other out of existence. Only a relatively few outside rays can take effect on the surrounding world. In effect, those 8 centers of 8 units each represent not a sum of 64 units, but only 26. This diagram is, of course, not more than a geometric analogy, a tip to make us see that a sum of energies may depend for its power on the arrangement, the order, the design of the unit. The simile of the telephone wires indicates that complete parallelity can have the effect of turning forces through induction and reinduction into a multiple of their arithmetic sum. The effect of disorganized units represents a fraction of their sum. The nearest we can come at present to the secret of culture is this realization that under the influence of a living idea, a certain number of people can accomplish miracles. They can make an historic contribution to the evolution of man's growth incredibly out of proportion to the normally expected result. Their strength is much greater than the sum of their individual powers. A disunited, badly designed number represents much less from the sum total of individual effectiveness. Unfortunately, this applies to all forces, constructive and destructive alike. When the creative forces are chaotically disconnected, they are powerless against the onslaught of well-coordinated destruction. Instead of the miracle of culture, the result becomes a tidal wave of tombs, physical and spiritual. At the moment it seems almost futile to reflect on the positive miracles of culture, while life seems to offer the contrary on such a gigantic scale. Nevertheless, it may be interesting to step outside for a moment and watch again the wisdom of historic forces silently at work. Quality. That which we call composition in art is more important than quantity. This suggests two other trains of thought. One is the difference between quantity mechanics and quality dynamics. The other is the importance of discipline, since there can be no order without discipline. When we mention quality, we think of degrees of excellence, vitality, intensity. We speak of a lower or a higher quality. This habit of speech points to a vertical movement. Especially when speaking of a mental or creative quality, we mean to indicate an ability to dive into the depths of problems and to climb to the heights with a stratospheric view. Descending into purgatory and ascending to heaven are the two steadily recurring symbolic activities of Promethean champions. The resurrection myth of Osiris in Egypt, the Greek mythos of Prometheus, Heracles and Orpheus, Jonah in the Old and Christ in the New Testament, Quetzalcoatl in pre-Columbian Poland, Dante's visions, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, Durer's Apocalypse and Passions engraved on copper and wood, and Bach's Passions and Counterpoint, Grunwald's, El Greco's, William Blake's ecstatic visions, Ghost Faust, Beethoven's symphonies, Wagner's Ring, they all sing of a titanic struggle between the satanic and the divine, the vertical pendulum between hell and heaven, the tragedy of man's cyclic damnation into chaos, darkness, and his eternal dreams of salvation into light and wisdom. It all represents the symbolic poetry of superdimensional reality. Let us make no mistake about this. It is not enough for us to declare photography an art. Not until photography produces this vertical amplitude can it be recognized as a vertical equal. Quantity. The other part of human history moves in a horizontal direction. Everything in man's three-dimensional world belongs in this category. All that can be defined, measured, weighed, bought, possessed, mortgaged, and sold, the entire labyrinth of phenomena that can be added, subtracted, multiplied, collected, insured, and forfeited, that whole world which Babbitts, businessmen, and politicians call real, but which Lao-Tzu and Buddha, Pythagoras, Einstein, and Heisenberg declared to be a trick world of relativity due to the limitations of our sense perception. We can summarize the situation thus. Horizontal developments, activities, jobs, etc., may be considered part of civilization. Vertical struggles, forces, achievements may be recognized as belonging to culture. According to this division, all matters of photographic, technique, equipment, production, business, organization, etc. are part of our horizontal civilization. Today's photographers. Vertical culture is nowadays obviously non-existent, except in a few lonely individuals who belong to that ageist dynasty of single beacons with whom nature seems to bless society, even in dark ages like ours. Anyone intimately familiar with the life of a pioneer like Stieglitz cannot fail to recognize the vertical trend of one to whom its equipment and technical perfection exist as means to dive to sources and to climb to heights. This vertical gift enabled this photographer to play the part of godfather to American painting and to be one of the few real pioneers of American art. No horizontal urge for business, success, or even for good photography can ever produce anything comparable to the deep penetration of the human soul manifested in his unforgettable portraits of Sherwood Anderson and Georgia O'Keeffe. With all due respect to the painters he sponsored, none of them seem to have half of the vertical pull he, the photographer, has demonstrated in his work and in his life. It is one of the rare wonders when a man has the magic of saturating a lens with the great heart's empathy, succeeds in pouring wisdom over the shutter, and endless devotion to the gamma of the emulsion. Some of his little cloud pictures are worldly sermons with a majesty that explodes the limitations of size. Some of Edward Weston's desert and seacoast photos are worlds apart from the multitudes of American scene shots. What the difference is would be hard to say. Weston's landscapes are not clever, not smart, not sensational. They are tender and fine, yet strong and great, simple and rich, infinitely soft and infinitely sharp, and yes, infinitely honest, with no horizontal thought of caste between the camera and nature. Some of Barbara Morgan's dance pictures of Martha Graham are breathtaking in their sincerity and power, and come as near to a great caliber of style and photography as anything seen in years. Yet there are even today photos with a vertical lift, photographers who dive and soar. Someday, more people will realize that one can commute between heaven and hell with a camera, as well as any other instrument of art. At the moment, we have to admit that whatever vertical tendencies exist are few and far between, often cruelly isolated and tragically misunderstood in a world gone mad in a race of horizontal superstitions. Realizing that maturity of photography is inseparably linked to vertical culture, we have to learn from pre-photographic periods how culture functions, particularly with regard to art. For that purpose, it might be profitable to look into certain phases of Far Eastern art. Based on a background of religious and philosophical concepts, Buddhism, Taoism, and certain schools of yoga, life and death, the world, man and his relation to the world had been given a living meaning. Space, time, light, motion, rhythm, sound, color. In other words, all elements of artistic expression have their important place in the symphony of the universe. Art itself was considered one of the noblest paths to Buddhahood by some of the sects. Out of such a conception resulted a twofold approach to art, consisting of the highest importance given to art creation and the obligation to protect art. Due to lack of space, we can only indicate that many famous stories in the classic literature of China illustrate conditions which sound like utopian dreams of a distant future compared with the Neanderthal logic with which we are trying to club our art situation into submission. Visual discipline. Even more embarrassing is a comparison of the barbaric slapstick methods with which we are attempting to cram our artistic mass production down a reluctant public's throat with the sensitive logic of art presentation in the Far Eastern past. The latter ensured a maximum of spiritual and aesthetic benefit for the art lover, and at the same time provided a refined code of cultural behavior for protecting the work of art from the insults which are inevitable when looked at by the wrong people at the wrong time in the wrong way. Any good book on the tea ceremony in Japan contains a description of tokemono, the room exclusively built and reserved for the tea ceremony. We mention the tokemono because the tea ceremony was a cultural cult without any ecclesiastical basis. Almost identical principles can be found in the cultural codes of religious organizations in dealing with their sacred art treasures, which in tombs, temples, or cathedrals were viewed in humble silence, in a praying mood of continuous meditation, undisturbed by smart aleck remarks about the values and similar considerations. For reasons which will become evident soon, we want to emphasize a few characteristics of this tokemono. With utmost simplicity as a keynote, an atmosphere of harmony and highest quality was achieved in the tokemono through refinement of proportions and flawless craftsmanship. A special masterpiece was hung for a special occasion in a niche. No matter what a man's rank, he would never be invited unless absolutely safe as to his cultural manners, and those few carefully selected guests had to enter in a bent position because the entrance to the room was built so low as to make any but a humble position impossible. In priceless cups, potent tea was served to stimulate the nerves to the point of highest receptivity, and then the little company meditated in front of the picture, which may have been anything from a few calligraphic master strokes of a poem to a flower, bird, animal, or landscape motif. Discussions or remarks aimed at asserting one's superiority of judgment and similar boorish pranks, so familiar in our art circles, was out of the question. It was usually more a test of the audience than a criticism of the picture. Since the picture's power lies in what it does to the spectator, it is the spectator's level which determines the living function of an art object. Art is as precious as it is kept, and that goes also for photography. Compare it with our situation. In famous galleries, walls are cluttered up with orphaned pictures never painted for that light and place, screaming for help or giving up in somber, dignified resignation. Hundreds of art schools turn out thousands of artists to enter a world of cutthroat competition for jobs. Many of them become teachers, teaching new multitudes to draw and paint, so that they in turn can teach multitudes who are not wanted. Commercial, social, and political abilities decide usually more than artistic ideals, and since the awakening of the American art consciousness, the organizers, committees, juries, dealers, collectors, museum boards, schools, unions, art clubs, political and social gangs have joined forces in an all-out mass slaughter of art under the banner of art sponsorship. Exhibitions everywhere, by everybody, for everybody. A horizontal brain tornado with quantity as the goal, the criterion, and the only meaning, while everyone knows that the more pictures you are shown, the less you can absorb, and the more people are dragged to a show, the less they see. This is not the place to describe in detail the savage nonsense which rules the gigantic national and international art racket, with its power based on empty pretenses, nor the omnipresent fear of talent and the really foolproof defense lines against genius. Photographers should be aware of this situation and realize what is in store for photography should it follow in the steps of art. Fortunately, photography is still not taken as 100% seriously as an artistic and cultural force in many places, and thus it may be spared some of the worst pitfalls of the present art situation for a while yet. It has the life-saving advantage of a late comer. As a matter of fact, young photography and its branches have been able to render cultural service where art, sponsored and managed to death, did not have a chance. Again, we can watch historic forces working secretly on most surprising things. This time it is a matter of cultural discipline. Our tokemono story indicated what all cultural periods knew, namely that meditation is one of the most essential factors in rendering the mind receptive to a visual or audible message. Without this state of increased sensitivity, no cultural experience can ever be realized. Musical performances would have been unthinkable without an almost fantastic amount of discipline of performers and the audiences. Yet while everybody takes it for granted that one symphony has to be played at a time, even if it takes an hour, and that thousands of people sit in noiseless attention until the last sound has vibrated away, pictures try to outshout one another in simultaneously presentation. I found that standing silently in front of a picture was taken as a personal insult by the artist, the collector, or whoever visited a studio or gallery with me. A refusal to join in criticism in front of a picture leads almost to open hostility. It would be embarrassing to mention some of the names of the art world to whom such barbarism seems indispensable. There is very little to be hoped for as long as artists and critics have to mind what the boys in the back room will have. Projecting and presenting pictures. However, photographic projection has accomplished veritable miracles along lines of visual discipline. Imagine those millions who, in groups of hundreds or thousands, sit silently, almost motionless for hours in dark rooms, concentrating on screen performances. True, the screen offerings themselves are, with rare exceptions, far removed from even a suspicion of vertical qualities. Still, regardless of the cultural crimes committed by the commercial film industry, there is something real about the way people try to snatch an illusion of life experience for themselves out of shadow figures, enough to carry away for moments of dreaming. While all this may be subject to discussion, it is undoubtedly true that in the process of regular consumption of questionable intellectual food, the public has undergone a rigid training in mass discipline, as no one would have dared to believe possible. It would have been probably considered an assault on people's constitutional rights had anyone tried to force such regimentation upon the masses for these or similar purposes. It is sufficient to watch the effect of older films on today's audiences to realize how much more sensitive the average eye has become to fine-toned values, to minutest nuances of expression, to the dramatization of light and color, and even to composition in space and time. Also, how much longer people are able to concentrate or hold a thread of action or a trend of thought than 25 years ago. Thus, it is only visual discipline exercised on a gigantic scale, but it also shows its results already in an amazing progress of visual and aesthetic standards accepted consciously and subconsciously. To a lesser degree, the same is true of still projection. Think of the number of circles of this country and Mexico. In the United States, it went parallel with the American Scene movement. Both movements had their corresponding efforts in still and motion picture photography, where the two trends at times merged intimately and advantageously in, for example, Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Meet John Doe, Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men and the Grapes of Wrath, and Lorenz's The River. Both tendencies, though necessary and artistically promising, were doomed to failure from the outset in the first place because of their must attitude, regardless of talent and inclination in that particular branch of creative expression, and in the second place because they offered too much opportunity to be sidetracked in political channels. It is too easy for weaker talents to forget art roots in favor of battle cries and slogans. Before the war, we had a countrywide infection, and paintings, graphic prints, and photographs were judged simply according to subject matter. Certain barns, especially red ones, prairie mills, trains, drugstores, gasoline stations, ornery people, if possible in some typical action or pose of social atmosphere, like cotton picking or picketing. Those were the subjects that acted as passwords, rendering a picture automatically artistic. The lack of such items condemned the picture and proved that the creator was no artist at all, at least as far as commissions, competitions, and exhibitions are concerned. Since Pearl Harbor, the natural preference for war consciousness and victory propaganda has changed the list of subjects somewhat. Of course, we do not intend to commit the same mistake in reverse. In all fairness, we recognize the remarkable heights reached by some artists, painters, and cameramen in the American scene and social consciousness art, when genuine inclination, talent, and special training pulled without coercion towards a certain subject. But even propaganda of the less subtle type defeats its own purpose if bungled into transparent stupidity by the wrong people at the wrong time. History of genre art. A study of art is particularly interesting because we cannot go all the time claiming photography's equality as an art with other arts, and at the same time insist that all books on photography should speak of photography only, because art is none of our business. How are we to find out what to expect in the artistic career of photography if we do not take the trouble to observe what happened in the many centuries of art history when similar problems came up? It is interesting to remember all the desperate battles which European artists fought for several generations to break the paralyzing monopoly of storytelling genre pictures, which started after Daumier had devoted his life and art to unmasking the corruption and frailty of society and institutions of his time, and after Millet had shown the monumental simplicity of peasant life in his paintings. Even the Dutch painter Joseph Israels had still a certain grand, simple, though at times sentimental approach. Those artists and their photographic followers chose peasants and fishermen because they were convinced that the simple life near to nature made better models for better art than the screwy artificialities of metropolitan life. This tendency, once accepted, turned out to be extremely successful as far as the market was concerned. Many painters were quick to realize that poor people had become gold mines on canvas, and so we find genre painting prospering in many parts of Europe and also in America in an imported way during the last part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. It degenerated in France under the influence of Meissonier's passion for miniature details, and in Germany it degenerated into the Tyrolean parlor natives of de Freger and the peasant with pipe, or monk with wine-glass recipes of Grützner and their imitators. One has to admit that photographs by Atget recording life in Paris are often on an incomparably higher plane than the products of most of his contemporary canvas ticklers of the genre racket. Among the front trench artists of the modern group at the beginning of the 20th century, we find only Picasso still trying to salvage the romance of poverty in his blue period. It did not last long in his work. His consumptive harlequin figures and poor mothers were not only the anemic parts of those paintings. A similar change from a strong start into a miserable routine can be observed in the lowlands centuries ago. Peter Bruegel, who is one of the major patron saints of many a modern social consciousness artist and photographer, started with a simple straight style which represented the most courageous protest of his time against the conventionalizing influence of the Italian Renaissance imitators. Bruegel's brilliant design, his crimpness of color, his shrewd juggling with dimensional effects, his originality of composition, and his wizardry in handling proportions evaporated in the hands of followers until we find again a measly genre painting choking in its own popularity, based on the conviction that poor people, social atmosphere, in other words, the subject matter, make a picture. The social aspect and history of art. In other periods, visual art was treated as a social force or as a direct instrument of social forces, without any attempts to force the descriptions of social conditions upon it. In Egyptian tombs, for instance, many remarkable reliefs were depictions of everyday life. In fact, most of our knowledge of social life in ancient Egypt depends on those tomb decorations which owe their creation to religious conceptions of an after-death life of the soul. They were made for an audience of post-mortem returning cause, a part of the soul, and for the gods, not for the market or propaganda among the living. No one can deny that art had the utmost importance in ancient Greek social life. It was in the center point of all religious cults and sports. It was understood that the artist was to create the most perfect models of ideal beauty for the representations of man and God. Except for sport themes, most of the subject matter in Greek art was of a mythological nature, while the Greek style largely lived by the influence of philosophy. The Christian era, early Christian, Byzantine, Romanesque, Gothic, and partly the Renaissance styles, saw art in the service for the church. Again, art played a most essential part in the social and spiritual life without insisting on social subject matter. In the Far East, we also find an overwhelming background of religious and mystic philosophies behind art. Only occasionally has art in China or India wandered into the world of strictly social subject matter. An exception occurred in Japan just when it was getting ready for the greatest change of its history. It was the ukiyo-e school with its popular trend of illustrations of the life of actors and courtesans, city views, and finally hokusai studies of workers in action and street scenes, which represent the bridge between the old Oriental spirit and the new era of westernization which followed. This attention to life and genre scenes does not by any means represent an intensification of art's influence on social life. On the contrary, it was in the old Japan that, to use the old quotation, everything from holding of a fan to suicide was controlled by aesthetic laws. This is very much in contrast to the brutal go-getting materialism of modern Japan. Probably the strongest influence on social life was exerted by art in magic society. In nearly all places where primitive life was controlled by magic conceptions, the artist and the master magician, medicine man, shaman, witch doctor, etc., were usually the same person. The statue of a demon was not judged by its decorative or aesthetic virtues, but only by its ability to produce rain, heal the sick, and perform other magic, just as photos and paintings and advertising art today are judged not by aesthetic standards, but mainly by the increase of sales which they produce. Magic art never bothered about a representation of social themes, yet it was at the top of the structure of social life itself. Social aspect of photography. A glimpse into the relation between society and art in the past is necessarily fragmentary. It is sufficient, however, to serve as a compass where the history of photography is far too young to function as a guide. Much confusion can be avoided if we keep those fundamental lessons in mind. Photography, like the other arts, has a social aspect which varies in intensity. All forms of visual presentation can be used. 1. To record social conditions, such as documentary. 2. To carry social ideas, such as propaganda. 3. To be a visual expression of society, as in through language. And 4. To be a creative force in social life, using cultural aspects. The more an art stays within the limitations of descriptive recording or social and political propaganda, and is depending on themes of a social or political character, the more it works in an indirect way. The greater the creative independence and its connection with the ruling spiritual orientation of a period, the more profound can its direct social power be. It does not take much to see that by adorning new housing projects for workers with photomurals of factory views and industrial labor, and presenting to the people at every opportunity the very things they have and all the time suffer from, you don't make the same impression as when you give them what they don't have, what they dream about. The widespread superstitious belief in realistic presentation as a cure-all defeats itself in time. Accurate facts mean astonishing little to living people. Sometimes the most illogical concoctions can have more reality if they answer emotional subconscious needs. That explains the enigma of popularity in the arts. Cimabue's Madonna carried through Florence in a triumphal procession. The erection of Michelangelo's David, Verrocchio's Colleone, Leonardo's Mona Lisa and Last Supper, Raphael's Sistine Madonna, Dürer's Munich self-portrait, and so on to Van Gogh's Sunflowers. In architecture there are examples from the pyramids, the Taj Mahal, and the cathedrals to Rockefeller Center. These works of art had a grip on people's imaginations and affections not always proportionate to their artistic level. On the other hand, millions of mothers with their babies have been photographed, yet none achieve the popularity of some Madonnas or even of Whistler's mother. Once in a while a photo like the smiling cat or the Chinese baby among ruins holds the limelight for a short time. While technical improvements keep on fascinating us and facts are often extremely interesting, we cannot feed heart and soul on efficiency. Only drawn or animated cartoons seem to have the ability to touch some ageless hidden spot in human nature, subconscious longing or secret mythology. It is interesting that photography has done little in this field except in motion picture cartoons, where Disney brings to life fairy tales and myths, Snow White, Pegasus, and Mickey Mouse. Cultural aspects. The great social problem today and in the near future will be the question of how to awaken photography to a cultural need. That is, to a status which will make it fit to become a full-fledged instrument of culture. From the sociological point of view, it would seem that every period, every society or social unit has a culture or cultures of different kinds and degrees. However, for purposes of understanding art and what we call historical cultures, it seems advisable to make more drastic distinctions. Since our vocabulary is as poor as our general understanding of such subjects, we are often forced to use the same words for very different phenomena. We can agree, though, to separate in this article the use of the two terms culture and civilization. It might be useful to reserve the term civilization for refinement of equipment, complexity of organization, standard of living, machine civilization, etc., which keeps it in the realm of practical material considerations. The word culture we shall reserve for matters of spiritual, mental, artistic life. It can be seen at once that civilization deals with or is based on measurable, definable, so-called facts. You can find out the size of a population, the ratio between the masculine and feminine population, the number of tons of food, income, taxes per capita, etc. When we come to culture, we are unable to discuss it in terms of measurable, definable quantities. Any attempt to define culture is necessarily futile, because culture and definition are two phenomena belonging to two worlds of entirely different dimensionality, which will be dealt with more in the later articles on dimensions and on evolution of visual consciousness. Since we have to talk about it somehow, we might try the photographic procedure and start with a negative. That is, approach it by way of elimination. When we speak of culture, we do not mean refinement of equipment, refinement of behavior, good manners, wealth, big business, social improvements, standard of living, culture, physical culture, chivalry. Nor do we mean any kind of economic, political, hygienic, military, or technical efficiency. Art, science, and education, generally speaking, are also not culture. Academies of art, museums, galleries, universities, colleges, and all other schools, laboratories, hospitals, cathedrals, temples, charity institutions, factories, skyscrapers, subways, airplanes, railroads, and other forms of communication, chambers of commerce, and boards of health, government projects, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, or any other system of government do not represent culture. But all of them might reflect it or participate in it to various degrees when culture exists. Experience in the past taught us that culture cannot be taught, willed, ordered, bought, sold, organized, forced into existence, or slavery. It may produce a style of living, a style of artistic expression, but it is not a style itself. Culture is rather that which creates a mode of life, a phase of consciousness. It is a vital force, a kind of wisdom, a spiritual efficiency, an extreme height and depth of existence, the intensity of an emotional, mental, spiritual union with life, a link between the individual and the soul, the destiny of mankind, a bridge between man and the cosmos. Yes, it is all of this, and yet none of it exactly. It cannot be described, measured, judged, or understood in terms of intellectual logic. It can only be lived when it is present, or not lived when it is absent. Like love, it is or it isn't. It is like the famous Tao of which the Chinese sage Lao Tzu said when more than 2,000 years ago, "The Tao which you can see, name, describe, or define is not the Tao." Culture is a creative phenomenon and can be approached only creatively. It is the genius of society. Cultural dynamics. History seems to indicate that culture appears when geographic, economic, social, and psychological conditions are ripe for it, and when science, knowledge, has collected sufficient data for creative imaginations to form a definite picture of the world as a basis to answer fundamental questions and to give direction to life. Then gradually matures a living conception of the nature of the world, the nature of space and time, of matter and mind, of our place in the scheme of things, and of the secret of the origin and the meaning and the goal of things. In other words, a creative relationship to the past, present, and future, or a meaning of life and death. Not borrowed answers, borrowed styles, borrowed religion, borrowed meanings, but a genuine living faith based on living experience. It is obvious that we are in no position to speak of culture now. In spite of unprecedented miracles of technic, wonders of megalo-organization, and mammoth production of peace and war goods, our knowledge is typically primitive in style and does not touch the meaning of things. We talk much, saying nothing. We know too little about a dizzy multitude of things. Never before have so many known so much about so little, and so little about so much. We have to learn an awful lot to become simple again. We are too strenuously busy, too active to have a culture or a conscious life. We are completely doped by the terrific narcotics of work, ambition, greed for possession, greed for pleasure, greed for knowledge, greed for power, greed for any kind of successful self-assertion, and mainly also time greed. We are satisfied to be on the go, not to waste time going, but we are disinterested in where we are going. Modern man has no answers to the questions, what is light, space, matter? What is life, mind, soul, nature, God? Oh, All we are able to produce are a few utterly static phrases about a mechanistic accident called the world running along senseless lines of chance. If we are not satisfied with that, we have to borrow answers created in distant lands long ago. In relation to a living culture, it is not so important how to correct an answer is intellectually. The creative virility is the thing that counts. Our inner poverty amounts today to a universal catastrophe. Education feeds us carefully devitaminated mental bread, which looks soft and good, but causes general areoflavinosis of the mind, rickets of character, pernicious anemia of thought, paralysis of our creative imagination, and a hideous atrophy of intuitive empathy. When I speak of our time as a period of primitive, devitalized thinking, I don't mean to criticize science or to convey any lack of admiration for individual achievements. On the contrary, it is in times of cultural vacuum when individual scientific and artistic struggles reach the most heroic proportions. It would be most unfortunate if our scientists would step out of the archaic phase of preparation to produce answers based on an entirely insufficient evidence, instead of collecting data regardless of their basic mystery. Anyhow, the general situation is now that we have one attitude towards life, another for religion, while science piles up tons of evidence contradicting both. Pseudo-materialism. Photography as a whole is a perfect expression of this neither fish nor fowl situation. Technically, it is driven by a feverish ambition to be up to the minute, and it would be an interesting story if one would have some means of collecting data on personal sacrifices made by professionals and amateurs alike in order to keep abreast in expensive equipment. American art. No horizontal urge for business, success, or even for good photography can ever produce anything comparable to the deep penetration of a human soul manifested in his unforgettable portraits of Sherwood Anderson and Georgia O'Keeffe. With all due respect to the painters he sponsored, none of them seems to have half of the vertical pull he, the photographer, has demonstrated in his work and in his life. It is one of the rare wonders when a man has the magic of saturating a lens with the great heart's empathy, succeeds in pouring wisdom over the shutter, and endless devotion to the gamma of the emulsion. Some of his little cloud pictures are worldless sermons with a majesty that explodes the limitations of size. Some of Edward Weston's desert and seacoast photos are worlds apart from the multitudes of American scene shots. What the difference is would be hard to say. Weston's landscapes are not clever, not smart, not sensational. They are tender and fine, yet strong and great, simple and rich, infinitely soft and infinitely sharp, and yes, infinitely honest, with no horizontal thought of caste between the camera and nature. Some of Barbara Morgan's dance pictures of Martha Graham are breathtaking in their sincerity and power, and come as near to a great caliber of style and photography as anything seen in years. Yes, there are even today photos with a vertical lift, photographers who dive and soar. Someday, more people will realize that one can commute between heaven and hell with a camera, as well as any other instrument of art. At the moment, we have to admit that whatever vertical tendencies exist are few and far between, often cruelly isolated and tragically misunderstood in a world gone mad in a race of horizontal superstitions. Realizing that maturity of photography is inseparably linked to vertical culture, we have to learn from pre-photographic periods how culture functions, particularly with regard to art. For that purpose, it might be profitable to look into certain phases of Far Eastern art. Based on a background of religious and philosophical concepts, Buddhism, Taoism, and certain schools of yoga, life and death, the world, man and his relation to the world had been given a living meaning. Space, time, light, motion, rhythm, sound, color. In other words, all elements of artistic expression have their important place in the symphony of the universe. Art itself was considered one of the noblest paths to Buddhahood by some of the sects. Out of such a conception resulted a twofold approach to art, consisting of the highest importance given to art creation and the obligation to protect art. Due to lack of space, we can only indicate that many famous stories in the classic literature of China illustrate conditions which sound like utopian dreams of a distant future compared with the Neanderthal logic with which we are trying to club our art situation into submission. Visual discipline. Even more embarrassing is a comparison of the barbaric slapstick methods with which we are attempting to cram our artistic mass production down a reluctant public's throat with the sensitive logic of art presentation in the Far Eastern past. The latter ensured a maximum of spiritual and aesthetic benefit for the art lover, and at the same time provided a refined code of cultural behavior for protecting the work of art from the insults which are inevitable when looked at by the wrong people at the wrong time in the wrong way. Any good book on the tea ceremony in Japan contains a description of tokomona, the room exclusively built and reserved for the tea ceremony. We mention the tokomona because the tea ceremony was a cultural cult without any ecclesiastical basis. Almost identical principles could be found in the cultural codes of religious organizations in dealing with their sacred art treasures, which in tombs, temples, or cathedrals were viewed in humble silence, in a praying mood of continuous meditation, undisturbed by smart aleck remarks about the values and similar considerations. For reasons which will become evident soon, we want to emphasize a few characteristics of this tokomona. With utmost simplicity as a keynote, an atmosphere of harmony and highest quality was achieved in the tokomona through refinement of proportions and flawless craftsmanship. A special masterpiece was hung for a special occasion in a niche. No matter what a man's rank, he would never be invited unless absolutely safe as to his cultural manners, and those few carefully selected guests had to enter in a bent position because the entrance to the room was built so low